putting them in the face of danger.
I appreciate that point, and we must make our position clear to the Taliban authorities that we expect them to treat women fairly and equally, as is obviously expressly provided for in the Quran, and we must also engage with the Taliban. This is a slightly controversial thing, but I was strongly of the view when Kabul fell and we had the change of regime that there was no point in the UK just standing on the sidelines and failing to engage with the Taliban. They may not speak for all Afghans, far from it, but they are some kind of authority in Kabul, even if a very imperfect authority. The UK must try to engage for the sake of the people that we are talking about, if we're going to get aid through. So that's why we sent Sir Simon Gass out, who did an outstanding job in talking to the Taliban. It doesn't because we necessarily relish the things that they have said or done, but we see practical advantage for the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you. Prime Minister, going back to climate change, how much of the 12.6 billion that you've pledged for climate finance will actually be spent on loss and damage?
I can't give you the figure now, Sarah, but I'll write to you. Loss and I think one of the reasons we got an agreement at COP26 was because we had the chapter on loss and damage. How much, I think, I'm sure the answer is out there, but I'll come back to you.
Thank you very much. I really welcome that you've signed up to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. So does this mean that you will now also change your policy on supporting fossil fuel projects in low and middle income countries through your UK Export Finance Organisation and the money that you give to the Commonwealth Development Corporation?
Yes, what we want to do is for middle income countries for every country that's having difficulty moving past coal, which is loads and loads of participants. The UK has pioneered, with our American and European friends, a new model, the country platform, where we set out the portfolio of projects that we want to support, but where we want the SMEs, the private sector, the big banks to come in as well. And these are projects where people can make a good profit as well as helping to cut CO2. So that's what we're working on.
Excellent, because the problem at the moment is the exceptions to that rule are pretty broad. So if you could take to look at the guidance that's being given to our finance institutes to try and close that would be really appreciated. I wonder also how you personally reconcile the new funding to support the global efforts to tackle climate change with the severe cuts to UK aid programme. I'm thinking specifically the money that we give to Bangladesh, which of course is vulnerable to flooding and sea level rising, is seeing a 62% cut in our aid in the next year. Ethiopia, where the climate change and conflict blight the lives of millions, will see a 55% reduction in the UK aid. So is it a situation that you're giving with one hand but you're taking away with the other?
No, because we are making a massive commitment to climate finance, as you know, which is of great value to those countries. And on ODA generally, in spite of the temporary reduction to 0.5 because of the pandemic, because of the exceptional pressures that we face, we're still spending £10 billion in ODA this year in 2021. That means that we are the third largest ODA donor in the G7 as a percentage of GNI.
We're the only G7 that's cut our funding, though.
And the sum, the percentage goes back up, as you know, by 24, 25. I think most people in this country can see what a huge sum of money we're giving to the world. They think it's right, but they also accept that in the grip of a pandemic, when we had to spend £407 billion to look after people in this country, it was right to adjust things.
I understand that, but I think the problem is that the immediate pressing issues are not being funded, and yet we're seen to be dangling money for climate finance in the future. So I wonder how you actually reconcile those two things together in your own mind.
We are funding the as much as we can of the pressing issues. 10 billion is a lot. We're investing more in, for instance, in girls' education, and we pledged another £430 billion with the Global Partnership for Education, for £1 million, I should say, Global Partnership for Education over the next 5 years.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You have, though, cut 183 million to girls' education this year. Thank you, Chair.
And please could we not forget the very important funding for securing women's rights to control over their fertility, so that we can help support population control in developing countries. Yes. That seems to be a very important part of
it. Is. And education, if I may say so, Sir Bernard, is the prior.
Yes, but education without access to contraception is not worth nearly as much, Prime Minister, is it?
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to the budget and spending block of questions. I'm sorry we're going to detain you a little longer, Prime Minister, but we're not that far behind, I'm pleased to say, despite everyone going over time. Mel Stride, Treasury Select Committee.
Thank you, Bernard, and good afternoon, Prime Minister.
Good afternoon, Mel.
In March, Prime Minister, you told this committee, and I quote, "I strongly believe in a low-tax government, and I am a low-tax Conservative." But I just wondered how you squared that with the fact that your latest spending commitments around the budget and the comprehensive spending review have led the OBR to forecast that the UK's tax burden will rise to its highest level since the government of Clement Attlee post-war.
But for the very simple reason, Mel, Mr. Stride, that the country has been through the biggest fall in output, not just since the Second World War, but before the Second World War, the biggest that I can see for a very, very long time. And we had to look after people throughout the pandemic. We had to spend upwards of £407 billion on schemes to keep businesses going, to keep people, to put bread on family tables, to look after everybody in the country. And I think everybody understood the huge fiscal impact of that.
If I can, I'd certainly accept we had to spend a great deal of money, but a big choice was made at the time of the budget, particularly with the forecasts having improved from March, as to what the Chancellor did with that extra fiscal space. And he had a number of choices, and two of those were, did he spend more, or did he relieve the pressure on tax increases? And the decision seems to have been taken that he would spend an awful lot more. In fact, in the budget, he trumpeted the fact that he was spending a greater increase in public expenditure than any government this century, I think he put it. Is that something you're comfortable with? And how does that square with your ambition by the end of this Parliament of getting taxes down?
Well, what the Chancellor also did was cut taxes for the low paid, very considerably, about
but overall the tax burden is going to rise, isn't it?
£1,200 for a single mum on or single parent on universal credit.
But Prime Minister, in the round though, the tax burden is going to go up very considerably. So we've had huge corporation tax increases, we've had a freezing of the threshold for income tax. These are huge, broadly based tax increases that are going on. And I'm just interested in how you think we're going to get those taxes down, given all the spending that's going on.
First of all, unemployment is much lower than forecast. People said it would be 12%. It's now actually running at levels we saw before the pandemic. It's quite an extraordinary thing. Unemployment is a very expensive as well as a very wasteful and hateful thing. So we're also seeing faster growth than many people forecast. We have the fastest growth.
But the OBR's forecast on growth going forward is fairly anemic.
We have the fastest growth forecast for the G7 next year. What I believe the Chancellor's strategy is, and it's what I certainly support, is to ensure that Britain, the UK, takes the steps now to deal with the the debt that we built up to deal with the fiscal impact of COVID, but also to make the long-term investment we need to drive up productivity and get growth out of the economy. Because just on the looking at if you want the big economic strategy, for decades this country has underperformed in productivity and
Can I just
growth.
ask on productivity, as you mentioned it, Prime Minister, you've urged at various points that companies should pay their workers more. Do you accept that if wages go up and productivity doesn't, and the ABR suggests it won't be moving very much over the coming years, that just leads to inflation? And are you concerned about inflation and the impact that could have on the public finances?
I think you've always got to watch inflation. The numbers today, I think, speak to the price of energy, the difficulties in global supply chains, an economy coming out of COVID. But I'd rather have a situation now in which there was a big demand for labour and an economy recovering strongly and people wanting employees, than a situation in which you and I remember well from decades ago, both in the 80s and in the 90s, of millions of people unfairly, unnecessarily having their talents wasted because of unemployment. That's far crueler. And what I hope is that we can see investments now leading to. You're quite right in the point that you make about wages without comparable productivity.
Well, this
increases.
is a critical point, isn't it?
But that's why we need to invest now in the other ingredients that drive productivity: skills, training, infrastructure, and making sure that people are able to live nearer their place.
That's right, and that will take time. If that investment is made, it's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to see productivity suddenly spike up in the next year or two as a consequence of that. And is not the danger that by talking up wages as we are at the moment, with inflation so high, knowing that productivity is low at the moment and has been since the financial crisis of 2007, that we're going to push inflation still further? We could end up in a wage price spiral that will have devastating consequences on the public finances. So do you think that maybe the government needs to be a bit more thoughtful when it comes to this urging employers to constantly put up wages without commensurate increases in productivity?
I think if I may say so, I think you're slightly over-egging what the government's been doing.
Yeah.
The government has, as it happens, I think that people should be paid fairly for what they do. I think it's right that the living wage has gone up, but wages and prices are not for the government to set. They're there for the market to agree.
But they do condition the expectation amongst the labour market as to where wages might be going every time the government says, come on, everybody's got to have a pay rise, but there's no productivity improvement to go with it.
Well, I think that.
Point
I think you're ascribing too much power. I think it was the Emperor Diocletian who tried that, and it didn't work.
Well, that's an essay question we'll know the answer to in time.
Work and Pensions Chair Stephen Timms.
On the budget, I welcome the additional funding for universal credit in the budget, but shouldn't some of that have been directed towards people who are not working? There's almost a quarter of people who claim universal credit are not required to look for work because of their health problems or because they're caring for young children. They all lost the £20 a week uplift. They're facing the big price rises that we know about. Shouldn't some of the help have been provided for them?
I understand completely, Mr. Timms, why you say that. But just to go back to what I was saying to Mel Stride, what we're trying to do now is encourage people into work, and so the situation at the moment is that we have actually in some places a serious labour shortage, and therefore the incentive should be to get people into better paid work, which is why I think the Chancellor was absolutely right to cut the taxes of the taper relief on universal credit so as to make work pay more for those on UC. Now, for those who are not in work on UC, I understand perfectly the point that you make, and they are people that we must look after in any event. But that for them, there are other interventions that we have, such as the £500 million for local councils, the energy price caps, the freezing of fuel duty, the winter homes, the winter fuel allowance, cold weather payments, and sort of support for the cost of childcare. There are many, you and I have talked many times about people who have no recourse to public funds. Yeah. Even they have those types of support.
Do you agree, I think you will, but do you agree that Social Security should provide an adequate safety net for families?
Yes, I do, but I think the best, it's very important, of course I do, but the best thing for those families is to help one member at least of that family into work. Yes. And that's why I think what we were doing with universal credit was right.
But our committee has heard from parents, for example, who will have to skip meals in order to make sure that their children don't have to skip meals because of the £20 a week reduction. That shouldn't be happening, should it? Shouldn't the Social Security safety net avoid that from happening?
Yes, it does, but
my point is it doesn't. I mean, certainly the evidence to our committee is that parents are having to skip meals at the moment.
Well, we're doing everything we can to support people in those circumstances. With the £500 million household support fund, I think it was the 200 million holiday activity and food programme for families who are in particular hardship. And I know how hard it can be for some families, but we are putting money into supporting those families. I think that it's also important to stress the value of work as the way forward.
Yeah, the headline rate of benefit at the moment is the lowest it's been in real terms for over 30 years. In those 30 years, the economy has grown by more than half in real terms, and yet support for unemployed families hasn't gone up at all in that time. That doesn't seem right, does it?
Well, I'll have to study those figures. The welfare budget, as you know, because you're a great authority on this, the welfare budget is still extremely big.
Yeah. Well, let me just finally quote to you a statistic from that House of Commons library that says that if you compare the level of unemployment support today with average earnings, it's less than it was when Lloyd George introduced unemployment benefit 110 years ago. There's something, I think, that's going seriously wrong there. Can I just ask about one different...
Can I just repeat my point? We're in a situation now where there is a massive demand for labour, and we want to encourage people through the benefit system into work, and that's why it's structured in the way that it is.
But you want them to afford meals, though. The meals,
of course,
yeah.
And that's why we have the protections that we have.
A final point, if I may, about a different topic. In our meeting in July, you kindly undertook to look at the online safety bill that we've discussed already this afternoon, given that one of its key objectives is to tackle online fraud. I know you've had a letter today from Martin Lewis, Sir Richard Branson, Dawn French and others who've all appeared in online scam adverts, calling on you, as we were talked at the meeting in July, about regulating online scam advertising or regulating online advertising in the online safety bill. Have you been able to make any headway in looking at that point?
Thank you. I haven't seen the letter from the people that you mentioned. We're certainly very concerned about online scams or online ads of any kind, and I know that we're looking into this. Again, I refer you to what we're doing in the online harms bill.
At the moment, the bill isn't proposed to regulate paid-for advertising. You made the point in July that you'd have a look at that.
Let me see what I can find out about that. Mr. Timms. As far as I understand it at the moment, the view is that the bill can't deal with every ill caused by the internet, and it may be that that's one thing that it's failing to do, one of many things that it's failing to do. But I will get back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Timpson. Angus Brendan McNeill, Chair of the Trade Committee. Oh, I beg your pardon, Tobias Elwood. I do apologise.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Prime Minister.
Defence.
We've had 2 terrorist attacks in the UK this last month. It's now 2 decades since 9/11, and extremism is now on the rise, no doubt spurred by events in Afghanistan. The internet is now more powerful than the pulpit in the mosque. Should we be doing more to tackle online radicalisation?
I think there's always much more that we should do to tackle radicalisation online or otherwise. And when you look at some of the cases that we've seen recently, it's clear that people are increasingly adept at using concealed devices to conceal their internet tracking, their internet history as they radicalise themselves. We need to be wise to that. I think what we also need to do, Mr. Elwood, is we need to be much more ruthless in joining the dots together, because so often with characters who cause responsible terrorist attacks or whatever, there will be things in their past that are signals or indicators of a likelihood that they will do this. And each of them individually may not be enough to trigger our concerns.
Can I welcome that? But I'm also interested in what is online and whether you think there should be more responsibility to be taken by the online organisations, and I hope you'd lean into this.
Yes.
Can I just move on? The last time we met here, you agreed the world's becoming more unstable, more complex. There's an increase in political warfare, along with a rise in extremism we just discussed, and authoritarianism. And we now see examples of that playing out in Eastern Europe. Can I ask what military assistance we can offer both Poland and indeed Ukraine to show Russia that we are serious about deterring any kinetic action?
The 2 cases are very different, as you know, because Poland has a NATO security guarantee, and under Article 5 we're committed to the defence of Poland, as you know. Ukraine, sadly for historical reasons, does not have the same guarantee from NATO powers. Actually, Ukraine doesn't even have a membership action programme, as you know. So what we've got to do is to make sure that everybody understands that the cost of miscalculation on the borders of both Ukraine and of Poland would be enormous. And I think that my impression, as I'm sure you would agree, having been to Ukraine several times, met people there, as I'm sure our colleagues have around this room, talked to them, I think it would be a tragic mistake for the Kremlin to think there was anything to be gained by militarism.
I put it to you that the only way that we're going to deter potentially Russia from its mass troops on the border with Ukraine from venturing into the Donbass region is by us saying now exactly what the consequences would be. I invite that for you to take that away with you. COP26 has helped illustrate just how fragile our planet is, but our turnaround to repair this damage is measured in decades, carbon neutral by 2050. This means that globally we must now brace ourselves for profound changes to our way of life over the next decade. Crop failures leading to mass food shortages, lands becoming too hot to live in, all leading to mass migration on biblical scales. This will test governments across the world, particularly in Africa. Does the Prime Minister agree with David Attenborough, who said, "Make no mistake, climate change is the biggest security threat that modern humans have ever faced"?
I think he's right in that, and actually I made a speech to the UN Security Council saying substantially the same thing.
Thank you. Bringing those two themes together. The Red Book here on page 40 confirms defence spending is set to fall over the next 4 years. The current budget has been stretched by the requirement to cover cyber and space domains at the expense of the traditional services. So tanks, ships, planes and troop numbers are all now being cut. Would you agree, Prime Minister, that the integrated review is arguably out of date and we now need to look seriously at defence spending to be increased to 3%?
No, I must respectfully, I know you're a great authority on these matters, Mr. Elwood, but I must respectfully dissent from you when you say that the integrated review is out of date, because I think what would be out of date would be to, first of all, we're spending record sums on defence, £24 billion to reform and renew our armed forces. 2.4%.
No, I know the numbers.
Yeah,
you know I know them well. I'm trying to say that
but what I'm saying to you is I disagree.
This is a peacetime budget,
I disagree
and
with
we've
you.
just confirmed that the threats are growing, and therefore we cannot manage. The budget is being reduced by 0.4%. I have it here in front of me in the Red Book. The point I'm trying to say is I'm simply inviting you to recognise the growing threats that are coming over the horizon and ask you to please recognise and reconsider where the integrated review now is and what we need to prepare for.
If you're saying, Mr. Elwood, that you think we should go back and prepare for tank battles in...
no, you're putting words into my mouth.
I don't know but you're saying that you've mentioned...
But you mentioned tanks.
On the European
we
border.
are cutting back on our tanks. What is amassing on the Russian border, right now on the Ukrainian border? It's tanks, arguably enough.
Well,
but that's besides the point. I'm saying step back, look at the wider security picture, look at our defence posture and see what needs to be done.
If you think that UK tanks are the answer, then...
No, now you're going down an avenue.
You're saying that we should commit UK tanks to the defence of Ukraine.
No. You're deliberately... I'm sorry. I'm really sorry you're taking us down this rabbit hole, because you know perfectly well it's not about tanks.
I'm not taking you down a rabbit hole.
Tanks are one element of a wide spectrum of our defence capability.
You brought up tanks, Mr. Elwood.
Tanks.
You brought up
aircraft.
Tanks.
48 aircraft, F-35s. You promised 138. You've cut back to 48. You cut back on not just tanks. Warriors have been removed completely. Hercules aircraft removed completely. And then 10,000 troopers have been removed. So we can talk about tanks, or we can talk about the wider spectrum of capabilities that have been reduced. At the very time I'm trying to make clear that there are bigger threats coming over the horizon.
Yes,
Prime Minister.
And I think what I'm trying to make clear is I think that it's now or never for the UK Armed Forces. We have to recognise that the old concepts of fighting big tank battles on the European landmass, which I think is what you're driving at, are over. And there are other better things that we should be investing in the FCAS, in the Future Combat Air System, in cyber. This is how warfare of the future is going to be fought in our advanced early warning systems, and that is where we need to be. I think that the investments that we are making,
you can't hold ground with cyber.
In new technology are absolutely indispensable to our ability to fight
the
wars of the 21st century.
And
I don't think that going back to a 1940s style approach will serve us well.
Okay,
Mr. McNeill, Trade Committee Chair.
So you're an advocate, as we all know, of Brexit. You're now an advocate of trade deals, which I think we'll both agree in the circumstances are a good thing, given where we are. Now, your government figures will say that Brexit will cost something like 4.9% of GDP, the OBR 4% of GDP, and we can correspond that for ease of understanding to £490 or £400. The question I want to ask you is, what will you recoup in the trade deals that you're now an advocate of? With New Zealand, for instance, how much will you recoup, either in percentages or pounds? And Australia, what will you recoup?
I think that both deals will give opportunities
numbers.
to... I can't give you numbers. It depends.
Luckily, I'm here because
it depends how much the Australians and the New Zealanders decide to buy.
Let the Prime Minister answer the question.
Thank you, Sir Bernard. What we do have is a big opportunity for Scottish beef, for Scottish
This
Scotch
is
whisky.
come on.
No, it's not. And these
Well,
industries.
the numbers you're looking for.
Let the Prime Minister answer the
Well,
question, and I'll come back to
respect, Mr. Chairman, he's waffling. I'm looking for numbers. He hasn't got numbers, so I'm wanting to progress.
Well, the UK deal alone could increase exports by about £100 million. That's quite a lot. That will be Scotch whisky.
It's larger.
Is that to be? Are you niggling? Are you
No. I'm
turning up your nose at that?
I'm saying.
Try
So
and
are
take
you
it in
against it?
turns.
SNP is against every free trade deal that's ever done.
No, I've just
and by
said
the
I
way,
agree with it.
never let it be forgotten.
Should listen to the
they were
question.
against joining the EU.
Stop heckling yourself. What we're looking for here is the answer is for £400 or £490 that Brexit costs. There 400 or 490 would Brexit cost. An Australian trade deal will take back £2, and a New Zealand trade deal would take back £1. So you're still £487 out of pocket. Is the deal that you've landed the British people, and that is why you have the problems you have. You're in a pickle with Ireland, as well you know. It's probably knows the British problem in Ireland. Has Ireland been independent a nuisance to you, Prime Minister? Because I sometimes wonder if you wish it never became independent and richer per capita than the UK, or are you quite happy that it has? I mean, what is your relationship with Ireland at the moment, given the threat of the protocol and your triggering of 16?
We have terrific relations with Dublin, and I think they're just about our biggest trading partner.
Fantastic. At least you didn't quibble that they were being independent and in the EU, and some of the wider-eyed Brexiteers do quibble about. Moving on, do you think yourselves, Sir Keir Starmer and Sir Ed Davies, should stop sending big-value donors to the House of Lords, commonly known as cash for honours, and seen as a very corrupt practice internationally?
I think didn't you raise that with me earlier on today?
Yes, and I'm looking for an answer. Well, it was actually my colleague,
yes.
Jonathan Edwards, applied. I happened to be sitting beside him.
That's right. I saw you jumping up and down.
And
Look, I think the answer to
should the practice end?
The answer to that is that these are by and large men and women who have contributed a huge amount to public life.
Like £3 million.
Until you get rid of the system by which the trades union barons fund other parties, we have to go ahead, or you have a completely taxpayer funded system of politics. We need to continue with a system by which public spirited people give donations.
But find themselves in the House of Lords. This is selling peerages.
The people who, the people you're talking about have done, I think, things that acts of great public service for a long time.
You say you believe in levelling up. When will you level up the electricity market that's working against many parts of Scotland? Green energy that could be produced in Scotland's islands is cost far more due to the structures of your government to take green energy to the main UK market than to buy it from the equivalent distance in the continental market. It's something, if you believe in levelling up, that the transmission and distribution costs need to be equalised for fairness, and not just that, but for climate targets to be caught. And a very serious point in Scotland's islands could, if interconnectors were there and the right CFD levels were given, could make you less reliant, actually, on European producers.
There is an issue about the cost of transmission, and you're right to raise it. We're looking at it.
Okay, thank you for that. Last point I want to raise with you was when we spoke in this format happily 14 months ago. I see you recall it. You said, I asked you about who would be responsible in the UK for empty supermarket shelves, and you said it's certainly going to be me and the government. Do you stand by that still?
Yes, I do. Because
you're responsible for the empty supermarket
What do you mean by responsible? Well, responsible for trying to help improve supply chains, and that's now starting to happen. But the problems, the responsibility for the problem is one that's caused by a great many global factors. If you're talking about HGV drivers, there are shortages of HGV drivers around the world. You did, I remember. But there are shortages of HGV drivers in the United States and in China and across the world. What we're doing now is trying to accelerate the progression.
Do you think Brexit's made it worse?
No, I think that it's a pan-European problem, and what we want to see is people in this country wanting to become HGV drivers because it's a well-paid, highly skilled job with good conditions. And I think sometimes, frankly, the conditions have not been very attractive, least of all for women.
Thank you, Sir Ben.
Well, Prime Minister, if you want me to renew my HGV Class 1 licence, I'm standing by.
Yeah, well, I think
Jeremy Hunt,
anyway.
Health Committee Chair.
Prime Minister, there's no one after me, so you can relax and take your time. I've just got 2 topics, and I'm sure we can get through them briefly. The first one is about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe.
Yeah.
Her husband Richard, as you know, just completed 21 days of hunger strike, and the Iranians have often linked her detention and that of Anousheh Shouri, Murad Tabaz and Miran Roof to repayment of a historic debt. Can I just confirm with you that as an independent sovereign country, the decision to repay that debt is our decision, and no other country, certainly not the United States, has any kind of veto over that decision to repay that debt?
Well, Jeremy, Mr. Hunt, you'll be familiar with the complexities of this sad case from your own time in the Foreign Office, and you'll know how difficult it has been to forgive me, to resolve. But what I can tell you is that we continue to work with the Iranians, but of course with other partners around the world, including the Americans, who have similar problems of dual nationals in detention in Iran. Am I happy with the way things are at the moment? No. Should we be able to sort it out immediately with a snap of the fingers by repaying the IMS obligations? Yes, in an ideal world that would be terrific. But as you know from your own experience, it's more complicated than that.
I do understand that, and I understand there are sanctions. Yesterday, Jeremy Wright, former Attorney General, said that because the debt predates the sanctions, there is a legitimate argument that it would be okay to pay it. But if you can't use a bank to repay it for various reasons, why can't we do what President Obama did in January 2016 and fly over a crate of cash to Tehran and just repay that debt?
Well, it's certainly worth considering. But as you know, there are complexities attached.
I do understand that.
And I think it is also important to recognise that there are other dual nationals, UK dual nationals, UK in addition to Nazanin, who form a part of the equation, and we have to be very sensitive to their needs as well.
I absolutely understand that. Now, there's one thing that you could say to all of them that would give them great comfort, which is that their fate won't in any way be linked by the UK to the outcome of the JCPOA talks in Vienna. They won't be used as a pawn to put pressure on the Iranians. I mean, last thing I wanted to say is Nazanin herself is under house arrest effectively, but she can see TV clips. Have you got a message to her about the 5.5 years that it's taken?
Yes.
And whether she can get home for Christmas?
I want to say to Nazanin, and she and I have been in touch, as I'm sure she was in touch with you when you were Foreign Secretary, that I'm horrified. I continue to be horrified by the ordeal she's been through. I have nothing but admiration of for the way in which she's dealt with it. It's been unbearable to witness, and I know how much she wants to come home and to see her family and to see Richard, to see her daughter, and to be able to come back to this country. I can tell you that we are working as hard as we can to ensure that we deliver that. It is not easy, and if I could tell Nazanin now that we'd have her home for Christmas, I certainly wouldn't. It breaks my heart that I can't make that promise, but we will continue to do what we can.
Thank you. Second area from me, completely different. It's NHS staffing. And we know that in the pandemic we've recruited 5,500 more doctors, 10,000 more nurses, which is very welcome. But we also know that there are 93,000 vacancies in the NHS, with shortages in every single specialty. Now, Sir Bernard, I and 5 other Select Committee chairs have put down an amendment to the Health Bill asking for independent estimates to be published every couple of years as to how many doctors and nurses we should be training. Will the government support that amendment?
Well, I'm very interested in what you're saying, and I'm very interested in the amendment, but we have our own targets and ambitions as government. As you know, we want another 50,000 more nurses, and we're on track to deliver that by the end of the Parliament. There is now a record number of healthcare professionals in the NHS, more than ever before. We are working as hard as we can to get more GPs, which was raised earlier with me in the House, and to get more radiographers. We're short in many key areas. Whether our campaign would be helped by the measures that you propose, I can't say, but we're very happy to study them.
Just to be clear, we're not asking for any new targets, just for independent estimates of the numbers that we should be training, given that it takes 7 years to train a doctor. But could I just ask you to put yourselves in the shoes of a doctor or nurse on the front line? So the Royal Colleges, just to give you the exact numbers, who are by no means political extremists, they're very reasonable. They have calculated we need 500 more obstetricians, 1,400 more anaesthetists, 1,900 more radiologists, 2,000 more midwives, 2,000 more A&E consultants, 2,500 more GPs, and 39,000 nurses today. So why would you not want to give those people on the front line the encouragement that we are at least, if we can't solve the problem right away, we're at least training enough for the future?
Well, I'm not ruling your idea out, Jeremy. All I'm saying is that we've set some pretty ambitious targets already. We've got record numbers in the NHS. We'll look at your idea.
Thank you. And last one, Sir Bernard, very briefly. Yes. All that training is funded by Health Education England, but even after the spending review, they still haven't been given their budget. Could you promise, with all these desperate staff shortages, that it won't be cut in real terms? The budget and the spending review add another 36. If you look at the health and social care, but the bit of it that's on training has not been settled.
Another 36 billion on top of the extra 92 billion that we put into frontline healthcare, on top of the 33 billion that we put in 2 years ago when we came in. I'm sure that there's within the NHS budget there must be funds for health education, but I will look at what you say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you very much.
You've been generous with your time with us today, and generous that you've given us the 3 sessions this year on top of the delayed session in January. So it's the 4th session.
This is the 4th session.
As you are right. Yes. But thank you for that, and we will see you next year.
See you next year. Thank you. Thank you.
Order.
Hello everybody, yes, and welcome to the afternoon agenda. I am Patrick Christys. I am of course not Alex Phillips. Now this show is all about your opinion and mine on issues that are, or at least should be, on your agenda. So, although we've been squeezed by Boris Johnson, I'm not the only person to have ever said that, am I? Here's what we've got in an hour. A rowdy and tense day in the Commons as the sleaze row rumbles on. As you may have seen there, the Prime Minister admitted mistakes and has been accused of being a coward. We'll have analysis on that with the one and only Tom Harwood. Insulate Britain protesters, or Insulate prisoners I'm now calling them, 9 of them who defied a ban on blocking roads have been jailed. Our home editor was in court, and not for that reason, and he'll join me later on. And with countries from Australia to Austria imposing restrictions on the unjabbed, today we need to talk about COVID freedoms. Should we rule out lockdowns for the unvaccinated? Well, that's on the agenda for the next hour. But what's on yours? Let me know. You can get in touch in all the usual ways. GBviews at gbnews.uk, or you can tweet me, of course you can, at GBnews. A diligent team is beavering away, monitoring all of your tweets, and we'll try and get them out on the airwaves if possible. We will, of course, at some point be giving you all of the latest headlines, but we'll be going to those as and when. There's a very, very packed agenda for you there. Alex Phillips, unfortunately, is off today, but I'm reliably informed that she should be back with you tomorrow. But like I said, let us know. Keep those views coming in. I am going to be going now for all of your latest headlines.
Hello, good afternoon to you. Your latest GB News this hour. I'm Polly Middlehurst. The Prime Minister has given evidence to the Commons Liaison Committee, as you've been seeing on GB News, amid the ongoing row over members of Parliament having second jobs. Boris Johnson said he recognised that action was needed and called for cross-party progress on reforms. He also accepted that it was a mistake to conflate the events surrounding Owen Paterson's suspension for lobbying with the case for reform.
So the intention genuinely was not to exonerate anybody. The intention was to see whether there was some way in which, on a cross-party basis, we could improve the system. Now, in retrospect, it was obviously mistaken to think that we could conflate the two things. And do I regret that decision? Yes, I certainly do, Mr. Brown.
A British F-35 pilot from HMS Queen Elizabeth ejected during routine flying operations in the Mediterranean this morning. The incident happened at around 10 o'clock. The Ministry of Defence says the pilot has been safely returned to the ship and an investigation is underway. The Royal Navy flagship is returning to the UK from its maiden deployment, which included exercises with the Indian military. A bomb disposal vehicle has arrived near to Sutcliffe Street, one of the addresses used by Liverpool bomber Imad El Swalmin. Police have extended the cordon around the property as they investigate materials found inside the house. Counter-terror police say Al Swalmin had been planning his attack since April. He blew himself up in a taxi outside a maternity hospital on Sunday. Officers are saying the 32-year-old was born in Iraq and had had episodes of mental illness. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, says Britain's dysfunctional asylum system meant he was able to remain in the country after his application was rejected. The cost of living has surged to its highest rate in almost 10 years. New data reveals that inflation rose to 4.2% in October, mainly due to rising fuel and energy costs. The Consumer Price Index measure of inflation is now more than double the Bank of England's target. The bank says it may have to increase interest rates in the coming months to tackle the problem. 9 Insulate Britain activists have received jail sentences ranging from 3 to 6 months for breaching a High Court injunction preventing them from blocking roads. The High Court has so far issued 5 injunctions banning road blocking protests on the M25 around Dover Port and on major London roads. Insulate Britain activist Tracy Maligan spoke outside the Royal Courts of Justice after sentencing, criticising the government.
Your government has now chosen to act, and it's chosen to imprison us rather than meet the demand. By imprisoning us, the government shows its cowardice. They would rather lock up pensioners than insulate their homes. They would rather lock up teachers than create thousands of proper jobs. They would rather lock up young people than take practical steps to reduce our emissions.
TikTok is doing a series of updates to its safety measures to better protect young people on its platform. The video sharing giant says it'll now improve the language used in its warning labels on viral challenges, along with the way it warns users over hoaxes linked to suicide or self-harm. They say that's because research found so-called alarmist warnings can exacerbate the problem. And Her Majesty the Queen has held her first official face-to-face engagement since missing the Remembrance Sunday service at the Cenotaph. She held an audience with General Sir Nick Carter, the Chief of the Defence Staff at Windsor Castle. The Queen, who's 95 years old, had been following advice from doctors to rest. That's all from me. I'm back in half an hour.
Hello everybody, you're watching the Afternoon Agenda, and today we need to talk about COVID freedoms. Our freedoms are not made out of wet tissue paper. They are hard-earned. They were fought and died for. The blood of many young men, boys and, frankly as well, innocent civilians has been spilled in the pursuit of freedom. Our freedoms are not flimsy little things that can be bought and sold or cast aside at the stroke of a politician's pen. Or are they? I look around the world now and I'm concerned, very concerned, that for political leaders their main focus seems to be crowd control and introducing measures that make it easier for them to control the population as opposed to actually letting it flourish. Now, all of the curtailments on civil liberties around the world are being done in the name of coronavirus. But I'm not sure that's where this will end. I think a few leaders have got the taste for it. Just think about the type of person who not only goes into politics, but then rises to a position of power. Why have they done that? It's because they want power. Having spent a few years at the sharp end of political journalism, I can confirm that these people are often very, very strange. And in many cases, it's not the national leaders that you actually have to watch out for, it's the regional ones, the people who lacked the talent and the intellect to make it right to the top, so settled for being a local leader. Well, when they now find themselves with power in their hands, they go a bit mad for it, like Victoria's Dan dictator Andrews, who I'll come on to shortly. Let's just survey a part of the world, shall we? In Austria, unvaccinated people were already barred from visiting restaurants, hairdressers and cinemas, but have now been put under full lockdown. This means that about 2 million people cannot leave their own homes. Their justification for this is that about 65% of Austria's population is fully vaccinated, one of the lowest rates in Western Europe. Meanwhile, the 7-day infection rate is more than 800 cases per 100,000 people, which is one of the highest in that region. There were massive protests, but of course, these fell on deaf ears, don't they always? Latvia, where 59% of the population are fully vaccinated, reimposed lockdown last month and has banned lawmakers who refuse the vaccine from voting on laws and taking part in debates until the middle of next year. They will also actually genuinely see their pay docked as well. Compare this to Russia, not often famed for its laissez-faire approach to life. Only about 35% of the population has been fully jabbed. At the end of October, Moscow shut shops, restaurants and schools in a partial lockdown, and workers were even given 9 days paid holiday to curb the infections. And that's all they did. So Russia, Putin's Russia, is now arguably more liberal than some European nations. It's certainly more liberal than Australia. There are now quarantine camps popping up around the country, huge 1,000-bed facilities. In the case of Brisbane, it has not one, but 2 giant electric fences around it. Case numbers have halved in Australia in the last month, and by the time these things are built, I think it's reasonable to suggest that the pandemic will basically be over. So what's the point? Australia is turning into George Orwell's prophecy. They're introducing laws that hand huge amounts of power to tin pot politicians, but naming them things like the Public Health and Wellbeing Amendment. I mean, come on. What this does is really shift the power to declare a pandemic and impose public health restrictions from the Chief Health Officer to the Premier and the Health Minister. So people's freedoms, on health grounds alone, are now no longer in the hands of a medical professional. It's all about the political leaders. Victoria Premier Dictator Dan Andrews, you know this guy, the one who said that you weren't allowed to take your mask off if you wanted to drink a pint outside. He always adopts the tone of someone speaking to naughty school children, which is ironic, because I think he actually looks a lot like a geography teacher whose wife's just left him. In America, Joe Biden, who, if some reports are believed, puts the Trump into President Trump, mandated the vaccine for federal workers. In addition, all US companies employing more than 100 people must require their staff to be fully vaccinated or have weekly COVID tests. This was announced in a speech by President Biden. That's basically a mandatory vaccine for 2/3 of the United States workforce, a decision made by a man who looks increasingly like he's just days away from being found wandering the grounds of the White House shouting at pigeons, demanding to know what the result of last night's Muhammad Ali fight was. These are all examples of personal freedoms and bodily autonomy being taken away at the stroke of a politician's pen. Look, we've got some similar examples over here, haven't we? Care workers and NHS staff are fronting up to mandatory vaccinations. I know that our population does seem to be a bit split on that, of course it is. I know they say they're not mandatory jabs, but in my book, if you have a vaccine, or you have to have a vaccine, otherwise you lose your job, well, that's pretty flipping mandatory if you ask me. I think it's worth having this discussion now about where we draw the line. Sajid Javid is holding Christmas to ransom as we speak. Get your booster jabs, or we might have another lockdown. Look, until someone invents a better vaccine, we're probably never going to be more protected as a nation from coronavirus than we already are. if the vast majority of people are double, then triple, then probably quadruple jabbed, then that's all we can do, isn't it, really? We have to live with this thing. We keep being told we need to live with terrorism. Well, I'm sure I'm not alone in wishing that this government took terrorism as seriously as it takes coronavirus. At what point do we say, that's it now, enough is enough, there cannot be any threats of any restrictions to our freedoms? I'll finish how I started. Our freedoms were hard-earned. Right, well, not since the last time I went skiing have I been able to say we go over to Austria now. Unvaccinated residents there, around 2 million of them, have been placed in lockdown. So the country has one of the lowest rates of vaccination in Western Europe, but one of the highest rates of COVID infection per 100,000 people. We can actually talk to one of those unvaccinated residents. It's yoga instructor Karina Hilmer. Thank you very much for joining us. There she is. What does this mean for your day-to-day life then? I imagine you're sick of staring at the same four walls, are you?
Yeah, I can't do very much at the moment. That's correct.
So just talk me through how this process worked for you. Do you mind me asking initially why you're unvaccinated?
Yeah, well, I thought about this very carefully, and personally, I'm not at a very high risk for serious complications. I don't have any underlying health issues. And obviously, you know, I take the precautions. I don't want myself or other people to get sick. I get tested regularly. And so I don't, for me, see the need to take the vaccine. And also there are risks connected to taking the vaccine. And that's what I base my decision on at the moment, yeah.
OK, and I understand that you get tested regularly as well. You have been getting tested regularly. So in your mind, does that kind of nullify the risk of you making other people sick? Because that's what this is all about, isn't it? Your government has decided that if you don't get the vaccine, you pose a health risk to others.
Yeah, that's correct. That's how they portray it. I see it, if I get tested regularly, then, you know, if I got infected, I would catch it pretty early on. And then, of course, you know, I would stay at home, as you do. But, yeah.
OK, all right. So do you see this as an infringement on your civil liberties? Can you understand potentially why your government might have done this?
Not really, because I don't see that just because you're unvaccinated, you pose a risk to the vaccinated people. Because as I understand it, if I choose to get vaccinated, it's to protect myself. So I don't understand why, as an unvaccinated person, I'd be a risk to somebody. I do understand that perhaps, I can understand the argument, about the hospitals and the ICUs, and that, if I were to get sick and I needed medical treatment. But as I say, I made that decision fully informed of all the information available to me at the moment. And I believe, as consenting adults, like, we all have to make that decision for ourselves. And I do know, that I can get COVID, and, I'm aware of the risks that entails too. But I believe, that it's my own decision.
How do a lot of the public look at you? Do they look at you like you're an idiot? Do they look at you like you're a dangerous individual? Do they look at you like you've made the wrong decision? Because there's a lot of people over here in Britain who have decided not to get the vaccine for whatever reason. And essentially, they're called idiots. They're dug out by the population. They're treated as pariahs a lot of the time, actually. They're treated as lesser humans. Is that how you are being made to feel over that?
Well, me personally, so far, I haven't had to have that conversation with anybody, but I do know somebody who's very close to me, and they have been told that, they wouldn't want to walk on the same side of the street as them, which, that's just, pretty harsh, I would say. And, as I see in the media and, some of the statements also coming from the politicians, it seems pretty divisive.
Are you still living in a democracy then, Karina?
Well, that's questionable on different levels.
What do you think is going to happen to the government at the next election? Because as far as I'm aware, the vast majority of Austrian people are OK with this.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I can't make any predictions about elections. And, I don't know.
OK, well, look, good luck to you. I really appreciate you making the time for me, but by the sounds of it, essentially you've got nothing else on now that you've been locked in your own home indefinitely by your government. Well, not indefinitely, but you know what I mean. Karina, thank you very much. Karina Hilmer there, who is an unvaccinated Austrian resident. Don't say that we don't get all the big guests for you here on GB News. Now, it's reported that Germans who are unvaccinated face lockdown within days, just like neighbouring Austria. Let's discuss the situation now in Germany with freelance news correspondent Thomas Sparrow. Thomas, thank you very much for joining us. So, are you all about to be locked down?
Very unlikely. It is not going to be a full lockdown like the ones that you have seen in the previous years. What is happening now in Germany, and in fact that's going to be discussed tomorrow in Parliament, is that federal states will be given more powers to decide depending on the situation in each state. So basically that means that the government here in Berlin will not want, and they've said it very strictly, they not want to impose a lockdown for the whole of the country. It would be on a regional or on a local basis, depending on how affected a specific country, a specific region in Germany is. So if you have a region like Saxony, for example, in the east, which has a very high corona infection rate and a comparatively low vaccination rate, they have introduced specific measures to restrict unvaccinated people, but other regions have not done so. So what we can expect is for more regions to impose restrictions. What we can expect is that there won't be a national lockdown.
Yes, OK, I understand what you're saying there. I raised a point in my opening monologue, which is that I think actually sometimes local politicians are more dangerous than the national politicians, because very often they lack the intellect and the skill to have risen right to the top. So if it's the local politicians who are the ones who might be making a decision about whether or not to lock down an area and curtail people's civil liberties, I wonder whether or not they're qualified to do that. Will the overall decision come from the federal government, the people right at the top, or will ultimately it be down to the people in charge of places like Saxony, as you just said there, to decide whether or not their local population goes into lockdown?
It's a mixture of both. So what has happened in the past year here in Germany and what will happen tomorrow here in Berlin is that you have a meeting, which is normally a very long meeting, a long-drawn meeting here in the Chancellery between the Chancellor, between the federal ministers, and between the 16 federal states, so between the 16 state premiers. They then agree on a set of measures that they can implement in the specific regions, so to say a set of measures from A to B or whatever, and then they can determine whether they implement those measures depending on the situation in their own state. The reasoning behind that is that there's no need for a national lockdown, that in the past, for example, Germany had a so-called national emergency, which will be in place until the end of this month. And authorities have already said that they're not going to extend that because they see that there is no need for the government to have specific powers to implement or to impose a national lockdown, that because people now have the chance to be vaccinated and because the regional differences are so stark, that you can have regional or local approaches that are much more effective to deal with the coronavirus situation than if you simply decide to have a full lockdown, closing public life, everyone affected, even if you're in a region with a relatively low coronavirus incident rate.
Do you think there's a chance that they might do exactly what Austria's done, which is just lock the unvaccinated away and leave the vaccinated? Or do you think it will be in an area with, let's say a high COVID outbreak, that may well end up being everyone locked down?
Well, some of the critics of the measures that are being announced or discussed by authorities, both at the federal level and at the regional level, say that that's precisely what's happening, that it's basically a lockdown through the back door, that basically what's happening is that unvaccinated people are not allowed to take part in public life. But what authorities are actually saying is that by doing so, by restricting the way in which unvaccinated people can take part in public life, they are also putting pressure on them to maybe take up an offer of a vaccine, or in certain cases, it could still be the case, for example, if they go to work or if they have to go to hospital or whatever, that they could still take part in that part of public life by having an antigen test, a negative antigen test, or even a PCR test. So authorities would say that it is not necessarily a lockdown, that they're basically trying to put these measures in place to protect public life in a specific part of the country.
OK, and what's the public reaction to this? Are Germans worried about their civil liberties being protected or lack of protection towards them? Are they pretty open to this idea? What's the mood music like on the ground?
Absolutely, there is concern about the general situation here in Germany. And in fact, one issue which has been a concern, a matter of concern all along since the pandemic began, was the possibility of having mandatory vaccinations. In Germany, it is not mandatory to have a vaccination. The government has stressed all along that it is against any form of mandatory vaccination. But what we saw in recent weeks for the very first time was a poll which revealed that a majority of Germans actually favored mandatory vaccinations. The government, however, has stressed that they are not willing to do so because it is ultimately up to each person to decide whether they want to take up the vaccination offer or reject it. And what the government is trying to do is increase pressure for people to decide voluntarily. If you look at measures, at specific measures, there is an increase in opinion polls for people who want stricter measures here in Germany to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. And there is also an appetite for stricter measures when it comes to dealing with the fourth wave. But again, the government has said that as far as mandatory vaccinations is concerned, they do not think that that is the way forward here in Germany.
Thomas, thank you very, very much. Thomas Sparrow there, freelance correspondent based in Germany, whizzing you through what's been going on over there. Fascinating, that, isn't it? He mentioned polls. We hear a lot about polls. And without wanting to sound too much like Michael Gove, I think we've all had enough of experts, haven't we? Have we had enough of polls? Because there were times during the pandemic, during the main bit of the pandemic, the main thrust of it, as it were, where polls were coming out talking about 72% of the population want mask wearing to continue forever, you know, all of this stuff. And I'm just not convinced that that really represented the nation. I'm not convinced that 72% of people that I know want mask wearing to continue indefinitely. I wasn't convinced that the vast majority of people that I walk past in the streets or walk past in the shops really were desperate for us to have another winter lockdown just in case. That's not what I was seeing, but hey, I'm not everywhere, am I? I can't be involved in every single community, I can't be involved in every single part of the country all at once. So maybe my snapshot of reality was different to yours. Let me know, gbviews@gbnews.uk. But let's talk about what this all means for civil liberties now with Madeleine Stone from Big Brother Watch. Thank you very much, Madeleine. Fantastic to have you on the show. Look, we've heard a bit of Austria there, which has just, of course, put a load of people, 2 million to be precise, the unvaccinated, into lockdown, the equivalent of chaining them to Chris Whitty's basement radiator. Then we went over to Germany, where they're thinking of doing something similar. I've mentioned Australia. It looks absolutely bonkers over there. They've got internment camps that seem to be popping up left, right and centre, and a man in charge of Victoria who I wouldn't trust to walk my dog. What does all this mean for civil liberties over here, though? It sounds like we're getting off pretty lightly, doesn't it?
Well, I think we should be really cautious when we look abroad and hear these kind of appalling things that are happening across Europe and the rest of the world, and really take stock of how these things can come to pass. I mean, if you'd said 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic that we'd be considering mandatory vaccines for certain staff members, for care home workers, I don't know if we would have believed you, because in the UK we've always had a very high rate of trust in vaccination and sort of voluntary policies which have always seen us in really good stead. But it's a really stark warning to us of the road we can go down if we embrace these kind of policies of medical segregation, essentially. You know, in times of crisis, civil liberties and rights do tend to slide. And so it's so important that we really draw a red line under this idea of medical segregation and don't pursue it in any context. You know, COVID passes are a form of medical segregation, shutting out people who've made a personal choice about vaccination from jobs and from areas of public life. And we need to start at the beginning, otherwise it, you know, inevitably will expand, and we could see a situation like Austria happening here in the UK.
Well, I suppose that's the concern, isn't it? It's the slow creeping, asphyxiating hand of the state into all of our lives. What I will say, though, about the care home jabs and the NHS staff jabs, I'm just going to call them mandatory vaccinations because that's what they are. Because in my book, if you have to have a job, otherwise you lose your... Sorry, if you have to have a jab, otherwise you'll lose your job, that's a mandatory vaccination as far as I'm concerned, right? So let's call them mandatory jabs. However, whenever I talk about them, which is fairly often, I usually get a flurry of emails in from people making, in my opinion, it might not be the point I agree with, but a perfectly justified point, which is, would you want your elderly relative in hospital being treated by someone who was unvaccinated? Would you want an elderly person in a care home being treated by someone who was unvaccinated? And I do think, I know I've banged on a bit about polling data there, that is probably one poll I can believe, which is that most people would want care workers and NHS workers to be jabbed. So in that case, is that an overreach of government power?
Well, I think that, you know, that's understandable, and I think, you know, there is actually really, really high vaccine uptake across the NHS and across care home workers. the majority of care home workers are vaccinated and have worked so hard to look after our loved ones. But I think we actually have to listen to what the unions and what care homes and, medical unions are saying themselves, that because these industries work on such tight, incredibly tight margins with their staff, actually it's far more dangerous to impose these kind of mandates, because even the loss of a few members of staff can put elderly relatives or vulnerable people in hospital in a much more dangerous position. So actually, it could really backfire. And we've already seen that happening in care homes across the country. Of course, the mandate came in just a few days ago, and care homes are really struggling because the loss of just a few staff members can have a devastating impact on the quality of care. And so it's already starting to backfire now. The government has sort of, I think, accepted this to some degree because they've pushed back the NHS mandate to later on. So if we look at, what good care looks like in the NHS and in care homes, it looks like having as many staff as possible, really. And forcing these people who've worked so incredibly hard to keep our loved ones safe and keep us safe over the last 2 years. We've gone from clapping carers to sacking carers. And it's really unconscionable that we're kind of asking these people to make this choice between their own medical freedom and bodily autonomy and a job.
Yeah, what do you make as well about, I know at Big Brother Watch you talk a lot about literal civil liberties, as it were, but what about the kind of almost mental health civil liberties that we have in this country? We have, as it stands, a health minister who is currently still holding Christmas to ransom, right? He's basically holding a big sword of COVID Damocles over whether or not you can carve a turkey next to your nan on December the 25th. Is this right? Is Christmas Day the preserve of a health minister?
I think this kind of coercive, threatening approach to public health is so damaging. It's damaging for public trust in terms of the COVID response, because if you feel like you're being pushed into things all the time, I think that does naturally make people feel a bit suspicious about things. So it's hugely damaging, for our kind of mental health, but also for actual public engagement in health measures. And this could have implications not just for the COVID response, but for long-term trust in the NHS, in public health measures, in vaccination in general. We've always had, really high levels of trust in public health in this country. We've had this fantastic vaccine uptake and really strong adherence to kind of social distancing, those kind of things, without this kind of constant threatening all the time. And so to reverse this policy now is really dangerous for vaccine uptake in general and for booster uptake. So I think it could really seriously backfire and push people away from taking public health interventions that are actually helpful and useful.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, actually. It's the question of kind of the medic that cried wolf, isn't it? How many times are we going to have to hear these threats and hear these threats? How many times are we going to have to feel as though we've been coerced before potentially some people just decide, actually, I'm not engaging with this anymore. And then the time that you really need to, then you decide that that's when you're not going to do it. And that's a devastating situation. But Madeleine, thank you very much. Madeleine Stone there of Big Brother Watch. Right. Ladies and gents, after the break, it's all been kicking off in the Commons. The Prime Minister's been called a coward and he's faced tough questions over the sleaze row. We'll have all of the analysis on that. But first, it's the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello again. Things a little cooler out there today, but the mild, mostly cloudy weather will be back for most of us tomorrow. What's going on? Well, we've had a cold front crossing the country. That's disappeared. It allowed brighter skies for many through the day today as high pressure's been toppling in. But these weather fronts are also toppling in and they're bringing rain and drizzle at times to Northern Ireland through this evening. And that wet weather is going to pep up across western Scotland, especially as the winds start to increase once more here. There'll be a bit of drizzle over northwest England, mostly over hills. For much of the south, it'll be a dry night, and increasingly we'll see a lot of clouds spilling in. But before it does, with some clearer spells, temperatures will drop well down into single figures. On to the details for Thursday, and mostly dry and cloudy, but it will be quite a wet start for much of western Scotland. Through the day, rain and drizzle will keep going over the Highlands and the Northern Isles, but elsewhere it should be largely dry. Patchy rain over the hills and mountains of western England and Wales. Some breaks in the cloud, a bit of sunshine for East Anglia and the southeast and northeast Scotland. If we see some sunshine, could reach 15, maybe 16 degrees. And even where it's grey, look at those temperatures back up into the teens. Pretty mild for the time of year. Staying mild and mostly cloudy during Thursday night, and we'll keep further rain going across northern Scotland. But again, elsewhere, bar a bit of drizzle over hills. Most places will stay dry and cloudy, and that's how we go into Friday. Again, predominantly a dull but dry day, maybe a bit of drizzle over the moors in the southwest, certainly rain at times across northern and western Scotland, and it will be quite windy here as well, so a pretty wet, miserable couple of days. But elsewhere, mostly dry, and again, it'll be eastern areas favoured for breaks in the cloud and a bit of sunshine on Friday. It will again see temperatures back into the mid or even high teens. Bit of patchy rain tracking south during the weekend, and it is also going to turn a bit colder.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk. Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage. I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back, everybody. You're watching the Afternoon Agenda with me, Patrick Christys. Now it's time for a quick check of all of those news headlines.
Good afternoon. The Prime Minister's been giving evidence to the Commons Liaison Committee amid the ongoing row over MPs' second jobs. Boris Johnson's calling for cross-party progress now on reforms. He admits it's been a mistake to conflate the Owen Paterson debacle with the case for reform. Vaccine passports are going to be mandatory in Northern Ireland. You're going to need one to go to nightclubs, restaurants and cinemas from November the 29th. Passports will also be compulsory for indoor events with 500 people or more. And a British F-35 pilot from HMS Queen Elizabeth has ejected during a routine flying operation. Happened around 10 o'clock this morning over the Mediterranean, with the MOD saying the pilot has now been safely returned to the Royal Navy ship base. An investigation is underway. And bomb disposal experts are at one of the addresses used by the Liverpool bomber. A cordon's been extended after suspicious materials were found inside. Counter-terrorism police say Ahmed al-Swalmin had been planning his attack since April. He blew himself up in a taxi outside a maternity hospital on Sunday. And 9 Insulate Britain activists have been jailed for breaching a High Court injunction that prevents the group's road blockages. The maximum sentence that's been handed to a protester is 6 months. The High Court has so far issued 5 injunctions banning road blocking protests on the M25, around Dover Port and on major London roads. Those are your latest news headlines. Now back to Patrick.
Yes, afternoon, everybody. Now, as you've been hearing, the Prime Minister's given evidence to the Commons Liaison Committee amid the ongoing row over MPs' second jobs. Boris Johnson accepted that Conservative MP Owen Paterson broke lobbying rules, and he suggested that colleagues misled him over there being cross-party support for his botched bid to protect the senior Tory. So some people have been well and truly thrown under the bus, haven't they? The Prime Minister told the committee it's important that the public have full confidence in the system.
There is a feeling that we need to be getting on and ensuring that we have the utmost propriety in our dealings with each other, with the public, and that the public can have full confidence in the system. And what I hoped to achieve was some sort of cross-party progress on that. Plainly that wasn't possible. What I would like to see now is cross-party progress on endorsing some of the, I think, very useful conclusions of the independent report on the report of the Independent Committee on Standards and Privileges of 2018.
Yes, well, joining me to discuss the fallout for the Prime Minister is former Trade Minister and former Conservative MP, Lord Peter Lilly. Thank you very, very much for joining us. Do you feel like the Prime Minister's now put everything to bed and we can all just move on and forget about the whole thing?
Well, I wish that were the case, but clearly the Pandora's box has been opened and we're going to discuss it for a day or two more before we get back to reality and discuss something serious.
OK, well, what's the most serious element of all of this for you? Is any of this particularly serious as far as you're concerned?
Well, yes, I shouldn't have suggested that nothing serious. It is important that MPs behave with propriety, obey the laws, don't break the laws over actually promoting their private or company interests. But it would be very bad if we threw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's actually an advantage for Parliament to have people who've got their feet in the real world outside. In fact, when I was an MP, I once, before a select committee, suggested MPs should be paid less so they had to have outside jobs, and thereby brought expertise into Parliament, were more independent of the whips because they'd have their feet and, could regain employment if they lost their jobs, and just had a greater sense of reality. Now, that wasn't practical because there are a lot of professions where you can't combine your previous experience with Parliament. But where people can, I think it's good that they should and do.
OK. Do you think that regardless of what the end outcome of this thing is, this has been yet another situation handled in a very chaotic manner by Boris Johnson? If what he said there is true, which is that he was misled a bit by the cross-party support, for example, he maybe misinterpreted the level of support within his own party for this particular thing, and that he was wrong, actually, to suggest that nothing wrong had happened. Well, that's kind of a trifecta of quite catastrophic errors there, isn't it?
Well, catastrophe is a strong word. He was busy dealing with what everybody tells us is going to be a catastrophe climate-wise. I think they exaggerate that too. Up in COP26, but most people who do believe that we're facing that sort of catastrophe would have thought he got his priorities right.
Do you think this is having an impact on him in the polls? The polls they always fluctuate, and you can believe them as far as you can throw them, which is not particularly far. So I think we can all accept that. However, there has been a bit of a dip, and part of me wonders whether the sleaze element is cutting through, or whether or not it's the fact that here's a chap who, I think really throughout his life, in fact, I saw him actually on an old episode of Top Gear 2 days ago, and he was certainly not pro-climate then, and that wasn't that long ago that he was doing that kind of thing. And now actually he's going to hit us all in the pocket with this big green agenda. He's also, let's be honest, not got to grips with illegal immigration into this country at all. I thought his response to the Liverpool terror attack was a little bit like a man going through the motions. Do you think the public are looking at Boris Johnson now and thinking, you're a massive disappointment?
Well, the amazing thing is that we have been ahead in the polls until the last week, whereas normally governments are behind in the polls. One thing I can tell you is that the problems we will face next year economically, which are the hangover from the COVID shutdown, will be much more serious than what we're going through now. There'll be inflation biting into people's incomes before we get back to real normality. And the economy is always more important than these Westminster issues, though they have their...
the show. We're going to have to leave it there. It's Lord Peter Lilly, former Trade Minister, former Shadow Chancellor and former Conservative MP. So who better to go to on this issue? Well, I'll tell you who better to go to. And he joins me now. It's GB News' political correspondent. It's the one, it's the only, it's the irrepressible Mr. Tom Harwood, and he's here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. A busy day in Parliament today, Tom, and a tricky one for the Prime Minister.
Patrick, your introductions just increase in terms of their adulation. It's remarkable. No, it's been an incredible day in Parliament, really, because we started off with an incredibly rowdy Prime Minister's questions. Even though there were fewer Conservative MPs on the benches than we'd normally see, there was quite a lot of noise. There was intervention from the Speaker. There was a newly emboldened Keir Starmer using some pretty remarkable language, going further than he ever has done before.
Called him a coward, didn't he?
He did indeed. And that was a language that, even though the Speaker called out the Prime Minister on some of his language, was not called out of Keir Starmer over by the Speaker, although Michael Fabricant, the MP, stood up a little bit later to ask Keir Starmer to withdraw some of his more barbed comments. But then, of course, there was the Liaison Committee. Now, this is a committee that the Prime Minister sits in front of and gets forensically grilled by the chairman of all the Commons committees, or at least a selection of them. It sort of rotates around, and that's quite an event. It's a 2-hour-long marathon. They extended it a little bit, and the Prime Minister was grilled on every topic under the sun in a much more forensic way than can happen in the noisy chamber. And then, of course, there has been this Opposition Day debate as well on standards that the Labour Party has brought. It's an incredibly busy day in Westminster and a less than comfortable one for the government.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Just talk me through a few elements of what Boris Johnson was grilled on today. We know there's the sleaze stuff, there's the second job stuff. There's quite a lot of other things, wasn't there?
Well, interestingly, in Prime Minister's questions, the first question that Sir Keir Starmer went in on wasn't about sleaze at all. It was about Northern Powerhouse Rail, which, of course, we're expecting the announcement of tomorrow. And Keir Starmer wanted Boris Johnson to say, to commit to that promise that he had made beforehand, that there will be a new line connecting cities in the north, a crossrail for the north, as he promised during the election campaign. Now, Boris Johnson didn't commit to that. He said that you'd need to wait and see what the announcement is tomorrow. But another line of attack for the Labour Party, especially given this government's levelling up agenda. If we're building HS2 connecting London and Birmingham, but we're not going to build connecting Liverpool, Manchester and other cities in the north, Leeds, that seems like a bit of a problem there. But then, of course, it was on from Prime Minister's questions and on to the Liaison Committee, where the Prime Minister for the first time said sorry for not wearing a mask in that hospital last week. He said he did so for about 30 seconds on his way in and then put it on, but that's a change in position where he sort of denied he didn't wear a mask earlier on. There was also scrutiny over the role of standards and how the Prime Minister approaches it, but also something very interesting from Caroline Lokes, the MP who accused the Prime Minister's father of slapping her on the backside in 2003, questioning the Prime Minister as to whether misogyny should be made a specific offence in law. The Prime Minister saying that he thinks there's enough statute to deal with this stuff already. We don't need to pile more laws on top of old laws, but what we do need to do is enforce the existing legislation more effectively.
Yes, interesting. It was certainly a very tough day for Boris Johnson. I imagine he'll sleep well tonight, or not at all.
Well, not at all, because, of course, for Boris Johnson, there's another event going on today, not in public, but the behind-the-scenes 1922 committee meeting. And so he'll be being grilled in private, so probably pretty forthrightly, by his backbenchers in just a few moments' time.
He's going to be absolutely knackered, isn't he? Yes, I imagine there'll be some red wine drunk this evening. Tom Harwood, thank you very much, as ever. Our political correspondent, whizzing us through a massively busy day today in and around Westminster. Well, still to come on the afternoon agenda. An update on those Insulate Britain protesters, or as I'm calling them now, Insulate Prison. They've been jailed for blocking the highway. But first, it's time for a short break.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Good afternoon, everybody. Now, 9 Insulate Britain activists have been jailed at the High Court for breaching an injunction, easy for me to say, designed to prevent the group from blocking roads as a form of protest. And don't you just hate to see it? Well, our Home and Security Editor, Mark White, was actually in court, and for that trial, not for another reason, and he joins us now. So a quick recap, Mark, please, of what they've been up to, what they've been sent to jail for.
For breaching this injunction, effectively that means that they are in contempt of court, because it was a High Court injunction that was obtained by National Highways on behalf of the Department of Transport and by Transport for London as well, mainly to try to stop the ongoing protests that were at first affecting the orbital motorway around London, the M25, but then a number of other motorways, Dover, up in even Manchester and Birmingham, were targeted just recently. So the injunctions were brought out, but they continued, these protesters, to launch these protests, these sporadic protests, usually at rush hour in the morning. And now this breach took place of the injunction on the 8th of October on junction 25 at the M25. That's the case we heard today. Yeah. There are other injunction breaches due to go before the courts. And the judges, I think, were left with no choice, really, but to jail these activists, because the contempt of court can carry a sentence of up to 2 years. They were never going to get 2 years in prison, but there was a distinct chance they would maybe only get a fine, suspended sentence, but they were blatant in their interaction with the judges by telling them that, look, if you don't jail us, we are going to go back out there and we're going to do exactly the same again. That left the judges really with no choice. That, and also the aggravating factors, which were the disruption that was caused and the risk to the public and the police service responding to this. This is what one of the Insulate Britain campaigners said on the steps of the High Court after that sentence.
Over the last 9 weeks, 174 ordinary people have held our government to account, asking that they deliver on the most basic of their duties, and that is to protect the British people, the economy, and all we hold dear for our society. Your government has now chosen to act, and it's chosen to imprison us rather than meet the demand. By imprisoning us, the government shows its cowardice. They would rather lock up pensioners than insulate their homes. They would rather lock up teachers than create thousands of proper jobs. They would rather lock up young people than take practical steps to reduce our emissions. They will lock us up and leave thousands to die in the cold this winter. We knew we would face prison when we took this action, but we cannot stand by while this government betrays the general public. Following the widely recognised failure of our government at COP26, we are continuing to ask them to get on with the job of cutting carbon emissions, of insulating cold and leaky houses, of protecting the people of this country from climate collapse, because the lives of our children and those of all future generations hang in the balance. To the government we say, you can't imprison a flood, There are no unlimited fines against a famine. You can't bankrupt a fire. To the public, we say, no one is going to save you. In the past, when governments have failed to protect their people, the right thing to do is to highlight the injustice, breaking the law if needed. This is what the suffragettes and Martin Luther King did, and it is what Insulate Britain has done.
There you go. Whether you realise it or not, ladies and gentlemen, you were watching somebody there equivalent to the suffragettes and Martin Luther King. So aren't we all very lucky to have that in our lifetimes? But look, on this, a lot of people, Mark, are saying, well, hang on a minute, look, you know, these sentences are nothing. But actually, they are quite significant sentences, aren't they? Especially in light of other cases that have happened recently.
Yeah, I mean, I was at Westminster Magistrates Court just over a week or so ago when the former Labour MP Claudia Webb was sentenced for threats that she had made to a friend of her partner, threats over many months, really quite awful, horrific threats to send pictures, nude pictures and videos to this woman's daughters, to throw acid over this woman, and she escaped with a suspended sentence. So it was certainly very possible, and indeed many people thought likely, that today the judges may have opted for a suspended sentence or a fine. But I think it was the way in which the protesters were so lacking in any kind of contrition and determined and defiant that they were going to continue, that the judges felt they were left with no alternative. And going forward, this sets a precedent now. There are 23 other cases imminently that are due up before the High Court for other injunction breaches, and dozens of others after that. Well, they've jailed them. They can't now suddenly turn around and say, well, we jailed them, but we're going to give you a fine. I don't think they could do that, not having set the precedent of jail sentences between 3 and 6 months, as they've done today.
Now, you were obviously in court. There was a mixed bag, really, initially, with people in the press recently who were on trial up for sentencing today. A couple of them said they were quite scared of going to prison. I think fair to say most of them said that they weren't scared of going to prison. What was the reaction like from them as they're sentenced?
I mean, I think if we're honest, and to be fair to them, no one wants to go to prison. They were probably all pretty apprehensive about the prospect of going to prison, especially, you know, one young man, Ben Taylor, 27 years old, I think he is, he's going for 6 months in prison. That's a fair old whack. In a prison alongside people who can be in for some, you know, pretty nasty offences. We know prison is not a holiday camp. It can be a pretty unpleasant environment for obvious reasons. So yet, I'm sure there was apprehension there. But they believe they have a higher cause, that right is on their side, and that this is a price worth paying. Actually, you know, to be honest, the organisation, from their point of view, they'd be very happy at the outcome today because they want martyrs that get the publicity, that show just how dedicated they are to their cause. They've been a very slick PR machine that has been behind Insulate Britain, that means in 9 weeks of campaigning and activism, they are much better known than the likes of Extinction Rebellion and other campaign groups that don't spring to mind quite as easily as Insulate Britain.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Mark, thank you very, very much for your time, as always. Mark White here, our home and security correspondent, editor. Sorry, I've demoted you again.
Oh, it's fine.
This guy,
I'll become a reporter, just.
Yeah, absolutely. He'll be secretary next, you know. That's absolutely. Well, look, we've got to just thank you, Mark. We've got some time now for some of your thoughts on the big issues of today. The big issue, in fact, was COVID freedoms. I was going on about that earlier, wasn't I? So should we rule out completely lockdowns for the unvaccinated? The emails have been flooding in thick and fast. Thank you very much, everybody, who's been getting in touch. We do appreciate it here on GB News. John says, I wouldn't rule it out, but if there is, there'll be more mass non-compliance. So John there, obviously, of the view that if there were any more restrictions, I suppose, certainly specifically targeted at the unvaccinated, there would be non-compliance. Graham says, absolutely not. We shouldn't rule them out. We need to protect our veterans and elderly as they have protected us. Now, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? And I know that a lot of people are very divided on this, and for me on that, I do understand it. I think that, you know, clearly if you had a vaccine anyway, I was under the impression, I was wrong about this, it's not for the first time, that potentially made you completely immune to it, or it would certainly make it impossible pretty much for you to pass this thing on. As we're getting down the line, that's clearly not the case, although the figures do show, or appear to show anyway, that it kind of takes the edge off, doesn't it? And I can understand that. And so there is a point to be had there, isn't there, that if you feel a sense of deep public duty, especially to the old people and to the veterans, then maybe you should actually have some restrictions curtailed if you don't get your vaccines. I couldn't say I agree with that myself, but I can see the argument there. Marie says, yes, we've had a vaccine rollout. We've done all we can to stop COVID. Time to live with it. Lockdown will have killed more than COVID ever did. And I think that's an absolutely cracking point, actually. I'd like to just dwell on that one for a second. Until someone invents a better vaccine, in my opinion anyway, until someone invents a better vaccine, or, you know, we have other things that can go with it as well, other components, other forms of medicine, which they are now putting out into circulation, that can help maybe take the edge off it as well. I think we've probably done just about all we can in order to try to nullify the risk of coronavirus. And actually, at what point do we decide that we have to live with it? You look at your NHS waiting times. You look at the mental health crisis we've got now, not just with adults, but with kids as well. You look at supply chain issues, etc., etc., etc. Actually, at what point do we go, right, enough's enough. We need to live with this thing. Well, that's quite enough from me. I think I've banged on long enough this afternoon for you, haven't I? I'll be back again tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. for To The Point with Mercy Maroki, as always. Now, you've been watching the Afternoon Agenda. It has been me, Patrick Christys, and apparently, I've just seen this again. Apparently, it looks like I'm doing it tomorrow as well. So there we go, 4 p.m. till 6 p.m. This is how I find her. This is how you tell me. On tomorrow from 4 till 6 p.m. again. Anyway, coming up, it's Michelle Dewberry with Jubes & Co. And I think now probably we've got some weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Good evening. Most of us will stay dry overnight and indeed for much of tomorrow. It's going to be a mild day tomorrow. Overall, fairly cloudy, but where we see some sunshine, well, temperatures could really jump up into the mid-teens. We've got high pressure dominating across much of the UK, but notice these weather fronts close by to the northwest, bringing patchy drizzle to parts of Northern Ireland this evening, and that rain becoming more extensive now across western Scotland, where it's going to be a fairly soggy night and a fairly windy night too. Patchy rain over southwest Scotland, northwest England, mostly over the hills, further south and east. Generally a dry night, and although it will turn quite chilly through this evening under clear skies, temperatures will start to rise as we head towards dawn as mild air moves in. Mild but predominantly cloudy conditions, but we could see some sunshine across parts of eastern England at times, staying dull and soggy across northern Scotland, rain on and off across the Highlands, but elsewhere any rain will be pretty light and again, mostly over hills across Wales and northwest England. Generally, it's going to be dry but cloudy and mild. Look at these temperatures, 13, 14, maybe 15 degrees if we see some sunny spells across Aberdeenshire. 16 is just about possible too. Now, the mild but fairly soggy conditions will persist across the far northwest, but otherwise it stays largely dry through Thursday night. Maybe a bit of drizzle here and there again around coast and hills in the west, but generally that's how we go into Friday with a lot of clouds, but most places staying dry. Still pretty breezy across northern Britain with the strongest winds in the far north, where it will stay wet throughout. Again, there we should see some breaks in the cloud across more central and eastern areas, and if we do, temperatures will really get up once more into the mid-teens. 15, 16 is possible, even where it's cloudy. 12 to 13 is above average. Some rain will slip south through the course of the weekend, and that will introduce colder conditions by Sunday.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
On Mark Dolan tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me from 9 p.m. to midnight every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't